Good evening to those bored enough to watch. Today, we turn back the hands of time to a more simpler time of the internet, 2014. Not inherently a time that we all crave to return to, but a more less relevant time of the internet. But today, we divert our attention from the scandalous side of the internet and focus more on the light-hearted side of it. While it may feel refreshing to look at the platforms we once loved before they turned into utter cesspits, we're not quite at our destination yet. This time, we don't look at YouTube, or Twitter, Instagram, or Snapchat, not even close. You guessed it, today we're talking about Roblox. For many of us, this game, platform, whatever you'd like to call it, has existed for as long as we can remember. Ever since I began playing the game, it has maintained a large library of games to play, some good, some bad, and others tend to be repetitive and boring. And while the scene nowadays is littered with the average simulators that's populated with 9-year-olds that supposedly have a bit too much time on their hands, if you look deep enough, you can find some gems that were buried in the constant onslaught of simulators and annoying children that built up over the years. And that is where we end up for the topic of today's video. Believe it or not, but the library of games on Roblox haven't always been so nonchalant. Even while scrolling through the page today, I find nothing to be interesting or eye-catching. Sure, some of these games may be genuinely good. You may see a game you haven't played in years there, but other than that, there isn't necessarily much to discover here. But today isn't about that. Today is about a game that I personally have had my eye on for quite some time now. Ever since I signed up for Roblox on the 27th of November of 2016. I'm sure you can probably tell what the game's called, so I won't waste any more time. The game I've had my eye on is Speedrun 4. Ah yes, who doesn't remember this game? Or for that matter, who doesn't know what it is? I'm sure everyone has at some point heard of it or played it. This game is a game that needs no introduction. I was initially planning on making this video essay on something else, such as my experience with school or something of that sort. Ultimately, I decided against it as the idea for this video popped into my head while I was playing the game. These last few months, I've been gathering footage and overall conceptualizing this video and planning it, and now work has finally begun on it. This game is one that I deem to be the better games of Roblox, which is why I've decided to make this video. I wanted a reason to share my thoughts on this game, and here we are today. So, with that said, let's talk about the art of Speedrun 4. Released on the 10th of October 2014, Speedrun 4 is a 3D platformer on Roblox consisting of 30 stages, of which I'll talk about in due course. For now, let's talk about the game itself and how it works, as it will be useful knowledge for the parts to come. Also, just a quick side note, recording this game was definitely quite the chore. When it comes to tech and overall getting things to work, I suck, so half the time OBS wasn't even working. So most of the footage was recorded using Roblox's in-game recorder, which made the footage look like it was from the 1990s and was quite choppy at some parts. At first I thought it was my laptop, until one of my friends with a brain told me to configure my settings with OBS's configuration settings. After that, most of the recording process was smooth, but the reason I decided to mention this is because I wanted to mention that I'll be using footage from both recordings, though I'll mainly try to prioritize using the OBS recorded footage over the Roblox recorded footage. That said, on with the video. When you first load into the game, you'll find yourself in the lobby. The red gems are awarded to you when you complete a stage. The amount of gems you receive when completing a stage gradually increases with different modes that you play, but we'll get to that later. You can use these gems to buy accessories and other things of that sort, as well as a remake of the first speedrun game, Speedrun Reloaded. You also see the stars, in which you can collect at the end of every stage in each dimension, which would mean that once you complete all of the stages in the normal dimension, you'd unlock another dimension and complete all of the stages and collect all of the stars in that dimension as well. This cycle would then repeat until you unlock and complete all of the stages and collect all of the stars in each dimension. That said, once you begin making your way to the first stage, you'll notice that you're walking at a rather slow pace. You'll also notice that the timer hasn't started yet. This is because the actual stage hasn't started yet. It doesn't start until you cross this yellow line. Your speed will significantly increase and the timer will begin when you do. You're ready to go. Now, not every stage is going to have a lobby, but this is the general procedure when you start every stage in the game. There'll be a yellow line in which you have to cross to pick up speed and start the timer. It's easy to see why this was done, as it wouldn't necessarily be fair if the timer started the moment you loaded into the stage, especially at the lobby where you have to walk quite a distance at a snail's pace to even begin the first stage. Having the timer begin immediately would be detrimental to a playthrough, as the main goal is to race the clock and beat the game as quickly as possible. To beat the game, you need to play through 30 stages. It doesn't really matter how long it takes, as regardless of the amount of time it takes, the ending is always the same. You're loaded into the winners level and you're basically free to do whatever you want, though there isn't really much to see other than the prompt to buy the bonus stage, the Final Destiny. I didn't buy this stage, simply because of the fact that it costs 1000 Robux, and I don't necessarily agree with the idea of having to pay so much for a single stage. I just don't see why you'd charge so much, especially when you have an entire remake of the first speedrun game for 100 gems. You know, the in-game currency of Speedrun 4. But, as I mentioned before I went on quite an incoherent rambling about the prices for a stage, there are 30 stages to play through in this game, so let's talk about that. Now that we're talking about the stages, the first place to begin is the first stage. It's rather simplistic, and the difficulty isn't necessarily something to be gawked at. The stage can be completed with relative ease. As you progress through the game, stages become harder and harder as you'll be required to jump through tight spaces more and more often as the game proceeds, some stages even being mainly revolved around this difficulty. That aside, now we move on to the second stage, this time being mainly revolved around the theme of a desert. The platforming is similar to the first stage, a lot of space to jump and move around on until you get towards the end of the stage, where there's a small platform you have to land on. You have two options here, to make one big jump and skip both of the platforms, or to drop all momentum and land on the first platform to make the two remaining jumps. Generally, you would want to go with the first option, as it saves a lot of time, mainly because you're utilizing all of the momentum from the first jump to completely skip the platforms and make one big jump to the end of the stage. Now we move on to the third stage. You'll notice during your playthrough that the platforms in this stage are significantly more smaller and thinner, thus meaning that there's less space to move around on. This makes the game harder because if you make a wrong jump, you may die and be forced to restart the stage. However, this stage isn't necessarily hard at all, because the platforming is fairly straightforward, because the platforms are fairly moderate in size, giving the player a fair amount of space to make jumps and land without the possibility of death in most occasions. Once you complete stage 3, we move on to stage 4. The platforming is relatively more easier than it was in stage 3, mainly because the platforms are more spacious. The only time the platforms get less spacious is in this section of the stage where you're forced to run and jump in a relatively tight space. However, this shouldn't be too difficult, mainly because you're landing on a platform that's spacious, which means that you won't have to worry about having to successfully land on another platform with tight spacing, which can be rather difficult as we'll see later in the game. I really like the music in this stage, mainly because of how calm and peaceful it is compared to the music used in other stages. I feel like it's used to symbolize the fact that you're in a seemingly quiet and peaceful atmosphere, which is visually represented through the sky and how nonchalant it is. I'm not sure though, this just might be my imagination going wild and me just overinterpreting things. After that, we move on to stage 5. The platforming in this stage can be completed with relative ease, much like the other stages previous to this one. I generally like to use this stage as a good example of the make it or break it mentality of this game. You can choose to make seemingly risky jumps and skip a section of the stage, which saves time on your run. Or you can choose to play things slowly and take the less riskier option. Jump to the other platform and then the one you would have otherwise gotten to quicker if you decided to take the riskier option. It would result in you taking more time during the run, but would ensure that death is prevented more than the other options. Now we move on to stage 6. This stage has certainly changed over the years, platforms having been raised to patch a bug in the game where you could run across the entirety of the stage. This bug had been rather prominent and had been patched for quite some time. However, you can still experience it for yourself in the older versions of the game, such as Speedrun 4 Classic. Moving on to stage 7, this is another stage that has changed over the years. These decorations you see here weren't actually in the old version of the game. It might have been added to appeal to the colourful aesthetic more, as the old version didn't really accomplish this very well. However, this is just my speculation. The stage plays out fairly normally. You have to make jumps from one small platform to the next, leading to the middle of the stage where the platforms increase in size, leading towards the end of the stage, where there's slanted platforms in which you have to jump, land on the flat platform, and then continue this cycle until you make it towards the end of the stage. The make it or break it mentality simply doesn't apply here, because making the jump from one slanted platform to the next isn't possible here, meaning that you're forced to land on the flat platform before making the jump. Stage 8. Straight off the bat, we can notice a change that was made in the environment. We can see that there was a grey horizontal pole added to the top of the holes where the toxic waste comes out. The stage plays fairly normally. It's not anything too difficult and it can be completed with relative ease. Stage 9. The stage plays fairly normally. It's nothing too difficult and it can be completed with relative ease. There isn't really anything of note here, so we'll move on. Stage 10. Again, not necessarily much to document here. The stage plays fairly normally and can be completed with relative ease. Most of the stages seem to be getting rather nonchalant, so I'll simply skip to the ones which contain attributes that I deem to be noteworthy. Furthermore, if I went and analysed all of the stages in this game, we'd be here for quite some time. Skipping 4 stages, we move on to stage 14. The stage plays fairly normally, and much like other stages, it can be completed with ease. It has a lot of platforms, a lot of which you'll jump on and from in short periods of time. Though in all honesty, I'm only mentioning this stage so I can have the freedom to acknowledge the strange music choice. Here, take a listen. Skipping 2 stages from that, we move on to stage 16. which has changed a lot over the years, adding this blocky segment that's riddled with tiny platforms to navigate your way through at the beginning of the stage. While the older version had more simpler platforming in its place, it isn't really anything too difficult to complete, to be honest, but I find it to be noteworthy of how seemingly the drastic changes between the two versions. Also, another fun fact, when completing the stage back then, you'd actually be loaded into a completely different game containing the rest of the game and its stages. The game was then updated to contain all of the stages without being split into two games. Skipping 5 stages from that, we move on to stage 21. This is quite the stage. The aesthetic, the theme, it just seems bizarre, but somehow it works as being a stage in the game. I mean, you're literally running on money, but it works. The game doesn't follow a story. The game doesn't need to stick to a certain theme. The creative freedom is there and it shows. I like this stage because it represents that. The game is literally just get to the end of the game, complete all 30 stages. Again, this just might be me overinterpreting things and overanalyzing it. Skipping 4 stages from there, we move on to stage 25. This stage plays fairly normally. While there are small platforms in the beginning of the stage and somewhat throughout, it can be completed with ease with well-timed jumps. It really isn't anything too difficult. I'm only really mentioning this stage so I can mention the music and how it's pretty cool, though I probably can't show it because I'm scared of getting a copyright strike. Skipping 2 stages from that, and we find ourselves in stage 27. This is probably one of the more harder stages in the game. Being revolved around replicating a candy land, this stage is hard because of the platforming and how precise you're required to be when making and landing jumps. A lot of people have found this stage difficult. Trust me, I would know. I was among that crowd of people at some point as well. However, as time proceeded and I practiced more and more, it became easier and easier as landing these types of jumps became more and more common overall. This stage may seem hard at first glance, but once you play it a few times, it gets easier. Trust me. Stage 28 is rather nonchalant. There isn't necessarily much to document here. It takes place in the skies, and you're supposed to be platforming in the clouds. It's one of the more easier stages of the final 3, because the stage that comes after this one is, you guessed it, stage 29. Stage 20-freaking-9. Where do I even begin with this stage? This stage is mostly filled with tight spaces to run and jump from, which means that you have to ensure accuracy to a very high degree if you want to avoid dying. I remember in one of my playthroughs I ended up spending over 10 minutes on this stage. While I have gotten better in playing through this stage, I still do find myself dying at times. Also, adding this in while recording this video, this stage is the entire reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. The amount of time I spent playing it ultimately led to the idea of this video popping into my head. So, here we are. I think I've spent quite some time on the stages of this game. There is a free bonus stage which can be accessed at the lobby, but in all honesty it really isn't anything to be gawked at. It can be completed easily and it really isn't anything too difficult. Now, returning to the lobby, you may notice a few skulls which read the different modes. While I didn't necessarily play through all of them, I did play through some of them, and I do have quite a few things to say about them. So, let's talk about the different modes in Speedrun 4. After beating the game as is, you can go and activate different skulls to play different modes. I played through a moderate amount of them before, and went back and did so for a second time for the sake of this video, so I thought I'd include them here and discuss some of my thoughts on them. The first skull is Zombie mode. It's basically just the normal game but with zombies placed in some, if not most parts of each stage. You're given a gun, in which case doesn't necessarily help much, but I'll get to that later. If you make contact with the zombies, they do damage to your health. 4 hits and they kill you. For the most part, I found the inclusion of zombies to be fine. I was intrigued with the idea, because it sounds pretty good on paper and it's executed fairly well. For most stages, the inclusion of zombies added much needed challenge to them. The problem comes towards the end stages of the game, such as stage 26, 27 and 29. Stage 28 is rather spacious in nature, so the inclusion isn't necessarily a problem there. But in stages such as the ones I mentioned prior, there is a problem because the platforms are so tight and thin to the point where there's just a plethora of zombies, one on each platform in some cases, and even worse, 2 or 3 being on the same one. Stage 27 and 29 specifically are cases that baffle me beyond belief. Remember that these are stages that are already difficult enough, and now in this mode there are zombies being thrown at you as you try to competently navigate your way through the stage. The main goal normally would be try not to miss a jump and die, but in this mode there is an additional one. Try not to miss a jump and die as well as try not to get killed by the zombies. That said, let's talk about the zombies themselves. When approached, they mainly run at you regardless of where you may be, as their main goal is to kill you and nothing more. They also make a sound that's supposed to replicate a zombie, I'm assuming, though I must say it sounds more like an angry dog trying to bite your leg off than a zombie trying to eat your brains. Not necessarily a complaint, I just find it funny, if anything. Here, take a listen. Quite funny, isn't it? Now I want to talk about the gun. Personally, I didn't find the gun very useful. In most stages, you'd find yourself running or jumping straight past the zombies, with some of them occasionally hitting you if you miscalculate your jump. But I do think that with enough precision and timing, you can avoid them altogether. Most of the time, I was confused on how to even use the gun. Running and shooting them at the same time increases your chance of death, since you'll be too focused on trying to shoot the zombies to even notice where you're going. Am I supposed to stop and shoot them? That breaks the pace entirely, which is pretty bad for a game about parkour. It's pretty bad game design, and even then, the zombies respawn almost immediately after killing them, so you're just better off taking the hit and running past them. Now we move on to the next mode. Mirror mode. It's basically the entire game but mirrored. It honestly isn't anything too difficult, and during my playthrough I found it relatively easy to complete. In all honesty, I found the zombie mode to be much more difficult than this one, which is odd because the zombie mode costs 30 stars, whereas the mirror mode costs 60 stars. I think these two should switch places, because the player should start off the modes with something simple and relatively easy to finish, and have that increase as you progress through the different modes. It just doesn't make much sense to have the zombie mode start off first and then the mirror mode, because you're starting off with something difficult and then continuing with something significantly much more easier than the previous mode. Not sure though, this is just my thoughts on the matter. The mode that comes after that is Rage Quit mode. When playing through this mode, you'll notice that there isn't necessarily anything out of the ordinary. No additional obstacles, no alterations made to the stage whatsoever. Especially when playing through some of the stages, I asked myself, where's the difficult part in this mode? Until I made a stupid mistake and died. That's right, it kicks you out of the game every time you die. Meaning that if you're really far into the game and die, you get kicked out and have to restart the entire game again. So essentially, with this game mode, you need to go through the entirety of the 30 stages without dying once, or you get kicked entirely and have to start the game from the beginning. I actually like this mode. It raises the stakes by one simple addition to the game, kicking you if you die. It adds to the challenge by having such devastating consequences looming over your head as you play the game, which somewhat increases the pressure and encourages you to try your best not to die. It also allows you to question whether you should or shouldn't take risks to make shortcuts, because in normal gameplay, if you die you can just shrug it off and try again. But here, you don't get that second attempt. If you die, you have to start from the beginning, and this mode presents that dilemma in such an enticing way. I think that this mode is executed very well, and I probably enjoy it the most out of the 3 I managed to play through. If you ask me, the modes in this game are somewhat of a mixed bag. Some are good and some aren't, whereas others are in the middle. I feel like if modes such as the zombie mode got fixed up a little, such as balancing out the placement of zombies and actually making the gun useful somehow, then I think it has potential to be a good addition to a game that's already very good. I only managed to play through 3 of the modes in this game. I tried out the impossible mode, but I immediately abandoned it when I realized what was so impossible about it. You have to play the entirety of the game upside down, and I think you can already see what's so difficult about this without me having to explain. I tried this mode, but I gave up before I could even complete the first stage. That's all I have to say about the modes in this game. There's definitely a lot that can be improved upon, and there's also a lot that I like about them. I didn't really get to play through all of them, since I rarely touch these modes. I generally just like to play the game as is. But it definitely was an interesting experience to play through these modes and express my thoughts on them. But I suppose we shouldn't linger on this forever. During my playthrough, I noticed a lot of strange occurrences that can also be identified in the footage. I wanted a dedicated section to talk about these, though the part will hopefully be shorter than these last 2 have been. So, without wasting any more time, let's discuss the strange occurrences I noticed during my playthrough of this game. During my playthrough of this game, there were a lot of things that I noticed, and I felt the need to include them in this video. I don't think it contributes to what I think of this game, since I'm not necessarily reviewing it from a technical aspect, but regardless, I wanted to make a dedicated part in this video where I could talk about these issues, because I feel like they appear so much in the recordings to the point where I have to talk about them. When loading into the game, I was having this issue where parts of the terrain ahead of me would load in and out. It didn't necessarily botch my playthrough, and I did find it rather odd, since this wasn't happening before when I recorded with Roblox's in-game recorder. At first, I thought it was an issue with OBS and Roblox, but then at times it began to happen outside of recordings. I'm not necessarily sure what the issue was, and in all honesty, the most reasonable conclusion that it was most likely an issue on my side and not the game itself. Another issue that I found pretty funny is during mirror mode, where, because platforms were mirrored to the way they were in casual gameplay, you could see people running on seemingly thin air during your playthrough of mirror mode. This isn't necessarily a complaint, and if the developer wants to fix it, then so be it. I'm just documenting it because I found it to be extremely funny. Similarly, you could see people run straight through zombies without them even acknowledging each other, because the other player and myself had completely different modes loaded, so you could get this really funny image where a zombie just completely refuses to acknowledge someone's existence. Again, I'm not necessarily complaining about this, I just find it to be funny. I guess I've discussed everything I wanted to in this video thus far. I did say that this part would be significantly shorter than the previous two have been, and ultimately I think I've accomplished that very well. I see no reason to prolong this part of the video, so let's conclude this then. Speedrun 4 is a game that was released in 2014, and 7 years later it's proven to still hold up as a stellar game that I find myself continuously returning to. Sure, it's changed a lot over the years, some stages adding and changing things that caused bugs in the older versions of the game, but that doesn't necessarily take away from the quality of the game. I think this game's amazing. It has replay value, as I always find myself returning to it to beat the clock once more and beat the game quicker than before, or other times I'm just bored and want to kill time. This was one of my first Roblox games I ever played among 3 others, and this game still has much more content contained within it that I wanted to talk about in this video, but for the sake of time I decided to leave it out and hopefully do it justice another time. Roblox is a platform for people to express their creativity and use their imagination to fuel that creative vision, and this game attests to that concept. We wouldn't have stages where we run through the fiery pits of hell, or on the clouds, a Candyland, and on literal money floating on the sky. This game is amazing. There's so much on Roblox I could have spoken about, but I chose this game to be the first attempt because of how much it struck a chord with me 5 years ago and still does today. It holds up. There are aspects of the game that aren't as refined and thought out, and I believe that said issues regarding certain modes can be fixed and ultimately made into an amazing addition to this game. But that's enough of my incoherent ramblings. I believe I've said enough about this game. I think it's art. It's not perfect by any means, but I like it, and for those who've never tried it, I'd recommend you do. Maybe you'll find some enjoyment out of it. So, with that said, I believe we've finished talking about the art of Speedrun 4, so why don't we cut to the outro? Oh, and before that, there's something else I wanted to mention about this game, but maybe I'll save that for another day. So, there's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. This was definitely an interesting video to make, seeing as how I've never really done a video like this before, but if there is anything you saw that could be improved upon, please do be sure to let me know. I'd love to improve on this style of format for the future. At the time of writing this script, it's been a week since I uploaded the update video, so I don't necessarily know when this video is going to come out. There will definitely be a few videos that come out before it though. This was one of the more bigger projects of the year, so I really do hope you enjoyed it. I want to keep this outro brief because this video has been going up for quite some time already, so I'll cut to the normal procedure. If you want to follow me, then my socials will be linked in the description, as well as any afterthoughts or messages I may want to add. With that, I have nothing else to say, so I'll see you all in my next video. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.